thanks very much for waiting to listen to this. I did do English at Edinburgh University, a useless subject, but I ended up working in a medical journal in Austria, and that's how I came to be familiar with the medical world. And then I was writing for the British Medical Journal and Reuters and various other publications like The Scientist. And that's why when I heard in February of this year that 72 kilos of vaccine material had been contaminated with the live bird flu virus by Baxter in Austria, I knew there was a big problem, and I started filing criminal charges. But what I'd like to talk about this evening is how the media is working together with the pharmaceutical companies to conceal from people what's really going on. And I just want to say that thanks to the independent media, we were able to do what previous generations could never have hoped to do. We can research facts, treaties and documents related to government actions and events for ourselves. And we can see today more clearly than at any time before in history the discrepancy between what is contained in those documents, treaties and regulations, and what the mainstream media and the governments is telling us is contained in these documents. For the first time, we can comprehend the scale and the nature of the monstrous and ruthless conspiracy that John F. Kennedy was talking about in 1961, before he was assassinated. Now, in 1961, this New World Order conspiracy was a vague notion, much like the contours of an island seen far off on the horizon remain indistinct and unclear. Today, in 2009, thanks to the information we can obtain through the independent media and by our own original research, we have reached the shores, so to speak, of that island, and we can see very clearly every single feature, every single cliff and beach and palm tree. We can really understand now how our political and economic systems are working and who is running them. And this awareness is growing very rapidly. It's grown enormously in the past year or so, and it's growing every single day. And the result is that the knowledge imbalance that has put humanity and us at a disadvantage for decades is now being redressed. And this is due to the emergence of the new independent and critical sources of information made possible by the invention of the internet and other communication and information technologies. Our knowledge of the New World Order, oh dear, I'm reading this and it's slipped all the way down. Let's see. Our knowledge of the New World Order is so detailed that we are able to identify the agents of this group as they sit on the boards of mainstream media companies, pharmaceutical companies, banks, and government bodies. And we can see how they're working together in a coordinated and synchronized way to obtain their objective, which is actually global government. Now, this global government can only be established on the basis of the negation of the power of the rest of the people of the world, and that is ourselves. The establishment of a new world government by a few at the expense of 6 billion people is an inherently violent act. In fact, it involves a violence on a scale never seen before. It involves a drastic reduction in the world's population by means of artificially created diseases, wars and famines, by taxes and the formation of totalitarian regimes. Nation-states, and more specifically the constitutions and civic rights they anchor, are on the verge of destruction, about to be superseded, and indeed already superseded, by supranational institutions such as the EU, the UN, WHO, and the IMF. And as we meet this evening, the Lisbon Treaty has already come into force, which will mean a drastic reduction in our civic rights. We're now in a sort of situation comparable to Nazi Germany in 1933. We haven't yet seen the stormtroopers coming into this hall and breaking up this meeting. But how many months will it be till we've reached that point? That will be dependent on what we do in the next few weeks. Our economies and our societies are being engulfed in a series of artificially created crises, pandemics, global warming, credit crunches, in order to pave the way for the creation, out of chaos, of a new global institutions that allegedly can master these problems in a better way. The UN, WHO, IMF and EU, These are the abstract power structures that are being set up all around us by a banking cartel as vehicles of their control. Accountable and democratic institutions are to be replaced by bureaucracies run by officials working in compartmentalized hierarchical structures. And they're not going to govern us as much as they're going to set down rules about what we are permitted and not permitted to do. And Codex Alimentarius is an example which has just been discussed, where these bureaucrats and officials will determine what we eat and what vitamins we're allowed and how much nourishment is going to be in our food. And it's not going to be much. We're essentially going to be put on a starvation diet, and there's going to be no way we can circumvent these rules without having to pay fines. Now, a key factor in the success of this global banking cartel, or whatever you want to call them, in their control is their control of the corporate mainstream media. Now, I worked for a lot of publications, also The Guardian, so I know from first hand just how censored the media is, and that's what started me investigating alternative sources of information. That's why I started looking at InfoWars and other websites, because I could see how my reports were being censored when they touched on certain topics that related to the financial interests of this group, like the price of oil or the boreal forest or whatever. Immediately the censorship came down, even when reports were commissioned, and I couldn't get them through in any newspaper, not in Germany, not in France, not in any country. And this was very different from my experience with other trivial reports, which I could get through without any problem. So I could see there's a centralized system of censorship in our media. The media has unfortunately become an instrument by which this group can conceal and hide the nature of their activities and the existence of the monolithic and ruthless conspiracy in broad daylight. You know, in order to get people to keep on tuning in, watching the TV or whatever, they've developed very sophisticated propaganda techniques, which includes giving a bit of truthful information, giving a bit of accurate criticism, so that people think they are getting an accurate source of information. The modern mainstream media can saturate society with images, with expert opinions, and with sound bites, and so shape our perception and attitudes towards events. The mainstream media can create the impression there is a consensus about how to tackle a problem when there is no consensus, and this allows the political decision-making process to be shifted from Parliament to the media sphere. You know, we have a problem like the swine flu, mass forced vaccinations, or mass vaccinations are suggested by the media as a solution, and that is then the policy that the government adopts. The swine flu pandemic, like global warming and 9/11, needs to be understood as a consciously crafted media event, as the product of a skillful media campaign, such as of the kind that is staged all the time in the newspapers and TV in Europe and the USA for commercial and political purposes. The true target of the swine flu campaign is not that which has blown up the swine flu virus. That is just a stage prop. The real target is you, the audience watching at home. The goal is to have a psychological effect on you. In fact, it's to terrorize you and to motivate you to go and take the swine flu vaccine, as well as to accept drastic restrictions on your constitutional rights and even to allow martial law. Now, just how real the possibility of forced vaccination is even here is been underlined by the fact that there was a parliamentary briefing note published on November the 12th, I think, which said that there is a legal basis for making these swine flu vaccinations compulsory in the UK. Now, that was only a month ago, so this is the direction we're heading in. The modern mainstream media makes it possible to distribute and disseminate powerful images instantly around the entire globe. We have pictures of children in hospital, we have patients on respirators, pigs in the mud, and all of these images can make the swine flu seem omnipresent and lethal when in fact there's no real pandemic at all. I think that's been clear to most people virtually since the day the swine flu first appeared in Mexico City in April. Only 8,000 people have died from it, according to the World Health Organization's own figures. I think it's probably 8,300 by now. That is just a fraction of the number of people who die from the seasonal flu every single year, which is 500,000 according to the World Health Organization. Now in California, just 2% of the suspected swine flu cases were confirmed to be actual swine flu after lab tests were done. In the UK, only about 15,000 cases of swine flu were confirmed by laboratory tests to be swine flu, according to information obtained through the Freedom of Information Act by Ian McGilvery. Another request that he put in revealed that the Scottish government has more or less reclassified all the seasonal flu deaths as swine flu deaths. So this year there's been no seasonal flu deaths at all in Scotland, as there usually are every single year. But all of a sudden there's been a huge number of swine flu deaths. I think it's now 48 or 50 or whatever. So what they've done is just shift all the seasonal flu deaths into the swine flu death column to try and persuade you that there is a pandemic when there is no such thing. A recent study by the Harvard University concluded that this swine flu pandemic is in fact probably milder even than the average seasonal flu. In fact, to justify declaring a pandemic level emergency 6, the World Health Organization had to loosen the criteria in April. Lethality was no longer required. The emergence of a new virus to which we have no immunity was no longer necessary. All that was required was this speed of transmission in 2 different WHO zones, and this was enough for a pandemic level 6 emergency to be declared in June. And this means basically the globe is put on red alert, martial law, kind of, absolute highest level of alert we're now under because of this swine flu. Every single country that is signed up to the World Health Organizations, which is, I think, 193 countries, are now obliged to implement these emergency pandemic regulations that WHO issues. But as I say, the swine flu pandemic is a media event which is just being put out there to get your attention. It's to influence your opinion, to persuade you to get this vaccine. But the real danger is actually from the vaccine. The vaccine is actually a bioweapon. If you look at biopharma databases and you check vaccines like Pandemrix from GlaxoSmithKline or Festatria from Novartis, and you look down the database at the regulatory status or index, you'll see that they are actually classified as biodefense stockpile drugs. That means they are bioweapons. And that is why they're being distributed by the military in countries like Switzerland and also Sweden and France. They're kept in military barracks. And when they leave those military barracks, they do so in military convoys, and they're going to special vaccine centers. They contain mercury, which is, of course, known to be linked with autism. And they also contain the adjuvant squalene, which is considered to be responsible for autoimmune diseases and the Gulf War syndrome, and which is illegal in the US and in the UK. As a result, how you're asking yourself now, how can we be expected to be taking bioweapons, But to enable this scam to go through, the special licensing procedures have been introduced by the European Drug Regulator, the EMEA, and under these procedures, the vaccines don't need to be tested for safety or efficacy before they're administered to you. Studies to ascertain whether the vaccines are safe are supposed to take place after the jab has been given to millions, if not billions of people, and these studies are to be performed by the pharmaceutical companies on top of all of that. There are no clinical data on how these vaccines affect pregnant women or children available at all. There's only limited studies on these groups started in autumn of this year, and these studies are not expected to be finished until the autumn of next year, far too late for the mass vaccination program. The only clinical data that exists in these vaccines are for pandemic mock-up vaccines in general, But they're different from the swine flu vaccine slightly. And even these studies were conducted by pharmaceutical companies, and there are big question marks about just how independent they are. Just how dangerous these pandemic vaccines potentially could be is shown by the fact that at least 20 people died in Poland after they took the bird flu vaccine jab in the summer of 2008. They took this as part of trials for Novartis's fluid bird flu vaccine, and this vaccine was actually almost on the verge of being given approval for use in the European Union before it was finally withdrawn. Right now, when we look at Europe, we can see that this vaccine has already caused a large number of deaths and miscarriages in almost in every single country. In Germany, at least 64 deaths have been reported after people have taken the swine flu jab, as well as enormous numbers of side effects and miscarriages and so on. I had one woman wrote to me and told me she had started developing all the symptoms of the autoimmune disease and the Gulf War syndrome just a few weeks after taking this vaccine. I know a doctor who took it and he became extremely ill immediately afterwards. So out of my own experience, I'm hearing these stories all the time. Thankfully, the turnout has been very low, and the vaccine centres are now being closed in Germany as a result of that. I think about 3 or 4% of the population has taken this vaccine, partly because many doctors have come out openly and stated about how dangerous it is. Nevertheless, no matter how many deaths are reported to the national regulator, the Paul-Ehrlich Institute, they always deny that there's a connection between the vaccine and those deaths. However, the objectivity of the Paul-Ehrlich Institute has to be questioned because many of its members who sit on the key vaccine boards have strong or close financial links with pharmaceutical companies. This is also true of the European Medical Agency, which is 2/3 funded by pharmaceutical companies, and managers belong to companies such as Baxter, Novartis, and GSK, sat as observers on WHO's vaccine advisory board. They were there in a key meeting in July, which recommended that the swine flu vaccination be given to the people of the world. As a result of that meeting, WHO announced a mass vaccination program, which we're now in the middle of, and the plans were for 4.9 billion people to be given this swine flu jab. So if it is a eugenics weapon or a soft kill weapon, they're obviously thinking, that that it could reduce the world's population by a considerable amount, or at least damage very many people. Danish journalists have reported about the close financial links between WHO's vaccine advisory board, SAGE, and the pharma industry. In February of this year, Baxter, Austrian subsidiary, as I mentioned at the beginning, contaminated 72 kilos of seasonal flu with the live bird flu virus and distributed it to 16 laboratories in Austria, Germany, Slovenia, and the Czech Republic. And this nearly started a global bird flu pandemic, according to the Times of India. And Sony, the Japanese company, sent out an urgent message to all its employees to return their families to Japan because of the imminent bird flu pandemic. That's how close we came to one in February. Why do I think this was deliberate? Because Baxter has to adhere to biosafety level 3 regulations in its laboratories, and these require that people working in the lab have protective clothing, that they manipulate the virus through mechanical arms, that the virus is in a special cabinet behind glass and stuff like that. Also, these labs are only accessible through double doors with electronic codes, and it's more or less can be virtually ruled out that this contamination was accidental, let alone a contamination of 72 kilos. The other question is, why did Baxter have the bird flu virus in its laboratory in the first place? Because it is one of the most lethal viruses in the world, and this is facility in Orson, the donor at least, is supposed to be just an ordinary flu production center and a research into other kinds of sort of standard vaccine material. The World Health Organization supplied WHO with this bird flu virus, or the genetic material for it. So we see a clear link here with WHO giving Baxter the lethal virus, which Baxter used to contaminate the material, and then distributed to the labs. And if it hadn't been caught by a lab technician in the Czech Republic in the lab of Biotest, it would have gone into vaccine material, and people would have got the bird flu from taking this vaccine. And then immediately, of course, WHO would have called pandemic level 6 and implemented this vaccination program very, very rapidly. It's important to realize that this bird flu virus, too, is actually a lab-engineered virus. It was reconstructed from the genetic material of a victim of the Spanish flu, this woman was dug up from the Alaskan tundra, I think in 1996, by Jeffrey Taubenberg of the Army Institute of Pathology in Maryland. He took out sort of lung tissue, and then he went back to his lab and he tried to reconstruct this deadly Spanish flu virus, and he and his team kept publishing their progress in journals like The Scientist or Science and Nature and so on. So you can actually follow the progress as they try to reconstruct this virus. And the H1N1 virus, they've also been working on, and it seems to be an earlier, less lethal version of the bird flu virus. Now, just a few weeks after the Baxter incident failed, we can say they didn't get away with their plan to start a bird flu virus in Austria and in that area. The swine flu mysteriously appeared in Mexico City, and indeed just 50 kilometers from another Baxter facility. The real winners of any pandemic are not just the pharmaceutical companies, it's also the World Health Organization. As soon as it declares a pandemic level 6, it acquires extraordinary powers over the local health authorities and the law enforcement authorities of all its member states. And crisis committees, which have assumed key government functions, are being set up. Indeed, they've already been set up in France and Austria, and I'm sure in the UK too. And this centralized government structure answers to the World Health Organization. So what we've seen, in effect, is a global coup d'etat. We now have an embryo already in existence, a little world global government around WHO. And if we look at what's going on in Copenhagen with the carbon or the carbon emissions treaty, whatever, you can see that the WHO will complement the UN when it comes to dividing up the control over nation states. WHO is going to take the health services, the military and the police, and the UN is going to take over control of the economies as a whole. So between them, they're going to have full control of our nation states, and this is happening as we speak. How serious the situation is can be seen if we look to the USA, to France, or to the Ukraine. The USA on the 23rd of October declared an emergency over the swine flu pandemic, and this allows the president to activate laws which allow forced vaccinations and quarantine, even in the USA. And people who refuse to take these vaccinations or quarantines are classified as criminals. This is also the case under Austrian pandemic plan, that if you are suspected of having the swine flu and you refuse treatment, then you're guilty of a criminal offense. And of course, the police are allowed to use deadly force against criminal suspects, and they're allowed to, bundle you into a van and drive you off. France is also on the verge of declaring a full-scale martial law. It was announced just a week ago, and could happen any single day. This will allow borders to be closed, schools to be closed, ban all public gatherings, restricted access to sort of, hospitals to orphanages to all social services. Body bags are being sent out to people. It's and you can be detained for 6 months without being shown or without having the judge having to be given a reason in France. As soon as this declaration goes through, already in France, 1,100 vaccine centres have been set up. Military pandemic vaccination teams are operating in these centres. 150 army vaccination teams are conducting vaccinations in these centres. Nurses and doctors have been requisitioned to work in them. There haven't been enough volunteers, and there are reports coming in of doctors and surgeons in the middle of operations, and the police are just coming into the hospitals and marching them away to work in the vaccine centres if they have not fulfilled their obligation to turn up at a certain time and date. This is what's happening in France right now. And in the Ukraine last month, the President Viktor Yushchenko declared martial law over what appears to have been an outbreak, a deliberate outbreak of the pneumonic plague or something similar to that. At any rate, a group of Ukrainian doctors wrote an open letter where they accused Yushchenko of committing genocide by means of these vaccines. They asked, why has the California H1N1 A virus, or how come it's turned up here in the middle of the Ukraine? Where did it come from? And they concluded that it could only have come from somebody putting it deliberately into circulation, and they said this was the government doing it, and they must have been doing it by putting it into the vaccines. Many experts think there will only be a pandemic if enough people take this vaccination, just as it happened in 1918 with the Spanish flu. It was the people who took the vaccination who were much more likely to get ill and spread that disease. And Greece, which had no mass vaccinations, also had almost no deaths from the Spanish flu in 1918. So you're actually putting people at risk if you go and take your swine flu jab. How many of you have been informed, though, about these facts by the media? And these are facts. If you go to the original sources and check the documents, check the EMA documents, for example, you'll see that these vaccines have not been tested for safety. They're being allowed under emergency procedures. If you check the pandemics and Fossatria documents, you'll see there are no clinical trials. Now, this information is just not getting through to people. Instead, anybody who refers to these facts and documents is actually called a conspiracy theorist and marginalized. The close alliance between the media and the pharmaceutical companies can be seen is underlined by the way James Murdoch, the son of the world's most powerful, perhaps media mogul, Rupert Murdoch, is a director of GlaxoSmithKline, the manufacturer of the pandemic swine flu vaccine. Murdoch's News Corporation is one of the handful of truly gigantic TV and newspaper enterprises that dominate the global media landscape today. And the whole swine flu outbreak in April, or since the swine flu outbreak in April, these news outlets have been telling us that millions of lives, if not billions of lives, are at risk from the swine flu virus. They're telling us that it's going to cause a significant number of illnesses and fatalities, disrupt our economies and societies, and that it has the potential to mutate and become more lethal. They don't mention that if it does mutate and become more lethal, the vaccines will be useless. We're told the pandemic originated among pigs in a slum in the failing state of Mexico City, but the pigs have never gotten ill from this virus, and indeed it's part pig, part human, part bird, part something unknown, so it has nothing to do with pigs at all, but the newspaper ignores that fact, which is the WHO itself has admitted, saying it has nothing to do with the pigs. The swine flu virus appeared in April at the same time as President Obama visited Mexico City, when the corporate media's full attention was already directed on that city. When we're talking about gaining the public's attention, we're really talking about gaining the attention of the cameras, and the way to do that, of course, is to provide good visuals, a good stage cast. The president is there, top-level negotiations, and so on. The swine flu virus made a dramatic entrance on the World Theatre. A museum director who met Obama, Felipe Solis, died the very next day, according to a report in Bloomberg. However, President Obama himself never took a test to see whether he had the swine flu virus, which seems rather strange considering how allegedly lethal and easily to catch this virus is. Some Mexican doctors have said that Mexico was actually the victim of a bioterrorist attack at that time. Anyway, the story of the media is that this virus overwhelmed the impoverished, overpopulated city, then the country. It brought the nation's health care delivery system to the verge of collapse, and it necessitated the drastic measure of putting the whole of Mexico City under quarantine. So the people there were cut off from food and water for 7 days, and there were riots as a result of that in April. We're told that the virus leapt across borders, it made its way to Canada and then to America, and now we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and it's engulfed Scotland, and 48 people have died from it. We're told that it's going to be, or could be, worse than the Spanish flu, which killed approximately 25% of the US population and as many 115 million people, especially US soldiers and the Navy. So watch out, US soldiers and the Navy, because we know that you're going to be the target for this time round. And we're constantly told by the mainstream media that this pandemic poses an overwhelming health management problem that can only be solved with the help of bodies like WHO and the EU and the UN. And we're told that the governments have been good enough to think about preparing for this, and they have prepared a mass vaccination program for us all, and that martial law may even be necessary to ensure that essential services don't break down as a result of the large numbers of dead people and absenteeism. And we're told that forced vaccinations and even quarantines will help prevent the spread of the disease. We're also told that the vaccines are tested and safe, and especially they're to be recommended for pregnant women and children. So basically, what the media is telling you bears no relationship at all to the facts if you actually go and do the research. But we're in a radically new media environment where reports don't need to have any basis in fact at all. They just have to create the emotional atmosphere that makes people believe there is a pandemic. They just have to construct a plausible narrative that allows radical change in the form of new control mechanisms to be imposed on populations. The swine flu pandemic is designed and intended for the CEN and BBC cameras, and it's designed for an audience to build a consensus for mass vaccinations, for the need to close down borders, and for the need to a more centralized government and even the deployment of the military. If you look at what has happened with the swine flu, you can see that the media has become a vital instrument in the gigantic fraud that is the swine flu scam. The centralized control of the corporate media is shown by the way the media outlets in every single European country and also in the USA are all giving exactly the same narrative, almost at the same time or each day. If I read German and a bit of French, and I can see how the same information appears in Germany and France, in America at the same time. For example, there was the story about how the vaccines had suddenly there was a shortage of the vaccines. This myth that there wasn't enough. And this appeared at the same time in every single country. But it's not only with the swine flu that science is being misused for political and financial purposes with the assistance of the mainstream media. Leaked emails from the University of East Anglia have revealed how raw data about the world's temperature is being systematically manipulated to suggest global warming is man-made when there is actually no evidence for this at all. This data was fed directly into the UN's IPCC reports, and is the basis for the perceived need to cut carbon emissions by imposing drastic new carbon taxes to be collected by the IMF under the direction of the UN. And the 9/11 is another example of a media-crafted event. Architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth have presented very convincing evidence to show that the Twin Towers could not possibly have been destroyed by the hijacked planes. The steel and concrete towers could only have been destroyed by explosives inside the buildings. Nevertheless, the destruction of these towers was necessary for the invasion of the Afghanistan to regain control of the heroin and also of the Iraq and the oil fields, and to justify an increase in the price of oil. The role of the media in constructing the 9/11 myth is shown by the way the BBC reported on the collapse of the third tower 20 minutes or more before the tower actually fell down. It was still visible in the background as the reporter was talking. In the virtual reality created by the media sphere, cause and effect can be inverted or just obscured, as is the case with the current financial crisis, which is the result of banks systematically withdrawing 1/3 of the money from circulation. This results in bankruptcies and economic collapse, and banks which have just received huge sums of money from the taxpayers in the form of bailouts can then go on a shopping spree and buy up all these things on the cheap. And by the time this economic collapse is over, they'll probably own 90% of all the assets in the Western world. I wouldn't be surprised. Now, once you've robbed people on this scale, and we are only just beginning to see the effects of the financial crisis, many people think this could be far worse than the 1930s. We could see states, countries going bankrupt, people not getting, their pensions paid out, their salaries paid out of their government officials. Once you rob people on this scale, you've got a big problem in your hands, because they're going to get very angry and they could well rebel and revolt, and they could go out and lynch the whole parliament and the banksters. And this is why I believe the swine flu pandemic has been timed to coincide with the economic collapse. We can see, in fact, how a number of these, plots are all being timed to work or to come together at the same time. The UN taking control of economies through the Copenhagen Treaty, WHO of the health and military through the swine flu pandemic, so that just as the economy begins to collapse, this group of people have their control grid in place. And of course the EU is another major factor in this control grid. Now, the problem they're facing is that the independent media is spreading information and doing it very, very effectively. More and more people are getting to become aware of the fact that the reason why their lives are so difficult and probably going to get even worse is not because of all these impersonal forces that are working out there, but because a tiny group of people have planned for them to have very miserable lives and determined to make them more miserable. And spread of this knowledge is becoming a great threat to the New World Order. We see in Europe people are not taking the swine flu vaccine. The take-up rate in Germany is about 3 or 4%. In France, I think 2 million out of 65 million people have taken it. In Switzerland, it's gone down to 12 or 10%, down from 70% at the beginning of summer. So people are really wising up to what's going on. And the media is no longer able to have the same effect that it used to have. The New World Order has actually used the mainstream media as camouflage. It's kind of like a beast, or like a chameleon that blends in with the background. It takes on the spots or the stripes of its background to appear harmless. So people don't notice it, and they're lulled into a sense of security. And the spots and the stripes of this beast are actually the mainstream media, the ever-shifting patterns that are played before us to give us the impression that nothing is happening. But of course, this beast has claws, and the claws are the many agents working in networks, such as the Freemasons and also Common Purpose, which Brian has discussed. The brain of this beast seems to be the collective decision-making process taking place at meetings such as the Bilderberg meeting and the CFR, Council of Foreign Relations meetings. And the heart of this beast seems to be dedicated, unfortunately, to Luciferianism or Satanism and occultism, whatever you want to call it, but to darkness and destruction. This is a very ugly creature, and it knows it's very, very ugly. It's a dangerous creature for us, and it knows that it's dangerous for us, and it needs to be able to present itself as harmless, to deceive us in order to capture us because we are its prey. These predators, or this predator, is very adept at disguise, at deceit, at telling lies, to lull us, the victims, into false sense of security. It has mastered the most sophisticated techniques of propaganda and mind control using the media, and most people, or a lot of people, still haven't quite noticed it. This beast can best be characterized by what Nietzsche called a willed power, an instinct, an appetite, a desire for more, ever more control, power, kicks, whatever. And these appetites set the goal, and then the will to power and rational calculations are activated to remove the obstacles to that goal. The act of removing the obstacles bit by bit actually gives these people, I believe, the feeling that they're alive. They become aware of themselves when they're busy thinking and calculating how they can get more control over us, you know. And I think this really is a beast we're dealing with, and it's kind of like the dragon we used to read about in fairy tales. We now can see it moving towards us with the swine flu vaccinations, which could become forced vaccinations even here in the UK and in other countries in the USA. We can see it moving towards us with this carbon tax, with this EU totalitarian police state, and with famine and wars. And it's been wounded by blows delivered by the independent media, but it is still coming at us with an uneven but determined way. And the problem with this beast it doesn't know what else to do. Its existence is based on the will to power, and it knows no other way of living than by seeking ever more power over others, and an act that is inherent, necessarily violent, and is going to result in our deaths, basically. And just like in the fairy tales of old, I think the time has come for us to go out there and slay that dragon. I don't think we can wait that much longer. Time, I think, is running out for us. With the Lisbon Treaty coming into force at the beginning of December, with the vaccination programs continuing, albeit at a very slow rate, much slower than they hoped, with the carbon taxes and the Copenhagen Treaty about to destroy our economies, I don't think we have years or even 2 years. I think we have a very short window of opportunity of maybe months to stop this. And I think to stop this, we're going to have to cultivate the old-fashioned virtues of the hero in the fairy tale. We're just going to have to get up on our horses, get out our swords, and go up to the beast, confront it, and simply slay it. Now, the act of killing this beast need not require actual physical weapons, but it will require us to be determined and to use our intelligence. This beast lives and breathes the oxygen of deceit, and we have to deprive it of that oxygen by spreading facts, evidence, and truth. This is an information war. Information is related to knowledge, and this revolution is in fact a knowledge revolution. It will be one if the circle of knowledge is expanded, and it will be one if every one of us expands our circle of knowledge. And if we spread that knowledge to other people, our understanding of the world at the moment is in inverse proportion to our consumption of the mainstream media. And the collection of reports that appear in the mainstream media are just there to create an artificial public consensus that suits the purposes of the beast. And the alternative media is not necessarily much better, just as the right-left political paradigm in the political or in politics is a false paradigm. The mainstream alternative media is also, to some extent, a false paradigm. What we really need to seek is the independent media, which offers objective facts and solid information. It's up to us then to use our judgment and decide, what do we believe in? What do we think is the truth? How do we, what do we believe is going on in our world? What is shaping our lives? And what are we going to do about it? And nobody can take that responsibility from each one of us. And the more knowledge we have, the more skills we have in reasoning and thinking, the better we'll be able to cope in this information war. We, I think, have to not only think about slaying this beast in the next few weeks, we have to think about what's coming after this. What kind of a future do we want? What kind of a society do we want to live in, and how are we going to achieve it? What are the practical, concrete steps that we're going to undertake to make this society a reality? We've all heard about revolutions turning into bloody, violent affairs in history as they've been hijacked by the very forces that we thought we had ejected from power. This must not be allowed to happen again. And the only guarantee for it not happening again is if every single person says, from now on, I'm not going to give my responsibility to elected officials or even to experts. I'm going to participate in the political process myself. I'm going to make the decisions about how the money is going to be spent in our community, how we're going to, whether we're going to install renewable energy, what kind of food we're going to grow, what kind of an economic little microsphere we're going to have in our community. This actually works very, very well in Switzerland. Switzerland is one of the few countries where there is still direct democracy at local level. People gather in places like this, and somebody comes along and says, we've got so and so much money, and these are the proposals for how we are going to spend it, and then people discuss and debate how their money is going to be spent in their community. And actually, it turns out to be extremely efficient. The communities are on the whole very well run, and there's very little corruption. Then people are elected to go into the parliament, and they're local people. They're people the Swiss know who are living in the house next door, the teacher in the school, and these people remain in the community even while they're serving their terms in the parliament. And there are lots of instruments for people to get information at a local level and federal information. They can ask questions, and the government is obliged to give an answer. And I think we need to go back to this model myself. I think we need to get more local about our decision-making process, and everybody has to start getting involved again in figuring out what's going to happen with their communities. I also think that we need to link up with people in the USA, in Europe, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia, and start a really genuine grassroots revolutionary movement in the next few months. That we're fighting an international corporate crime syndicate, and we can only do this effectively if we join forces across the whole globe. Indeed, we have a great opportunity. We have an opportunity to found a really peaceful, prosperous new era if we work together. I believe, we can't know what the outcome is going to be of our efforts. We don't know what's going to happen in a week or 2 weeks' time. We don't know if a nuclear bomb is going to go off or what factors are going to come into play. But I do believe that if every single person in this room decides, I want to make a difference, I can make a difference, I will build this better world, then it will happen sooner or later. It is up to every single person here tonight to I believe, to accept the responsibility and the challenge that is facing our particular generation for the sake of the next generation and people in other countries. And I ask you please to get up there and slay the dragon. So that's my presentation.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors, for as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.